Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am so glad you're tuning in today, because we're about to map out a truly fascinating and honestly deeply critical chain reaction. We're going to trace exactly how human activity triggers this massive cascade of effects across our physical geography and our society. We'll be looking at everything from macro-level pollution all the way down to the human consequences. And then finally we'll dive into some real-world solutions.
This whole topic really boils down to one massive question. And I want you to keep this in the back of your mind as we go through today's explainer. What actually happens when the land we rely on can no longer support us? Like, where do people go? What happens to our cities, our health, our local communities? The stakes here literally couldn't be higher, and seeing how these environmental puzzle pieces connect to our daily lives is incredibly eye-opening.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the core types of pollution. Next, we'll look at land degradation and urban waste. Then we'll explore rural migration and city slums. And finally, we'll wrap up with a community-driven environmental solution. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the core types of pollution.
Okay, so our source gives us a really solid baseline to start with. Environmental pollution is at its core the release of substances and energy from the waste products of human activities. Now sure, natural events like landslides or decomposing plants do create pollutants, but make no mistake, it's the human sources, our industrial, agricultural, and cultural activities that are the real, overwhelming cause for concern here.
And when we talk about human activity, industry is just the biggest culprit by a mile, especially when it comes to our water. Industries are churning out chemical residuals, poisonous gases, heavy metals, dust, you name it. The major water-polluting industries, things like leather, pulp and paper, textiles, and chemicals, they frequently just dump their waste directly into running water or lakes, and that doesn't just dirty the water, right? It actively destroys the entire biosystem of those water bodies. It completely overwhelms the water's natural ability to purify itself.
And the human cost here? It's actually staggering. Just look at this data from the World Health Organization. In India, a full 1/4, so 25% of all communicable diseases are waterborne. We are talking about severe, debilitating illnesses like diarrhea, intestinal worms, and hepatitis. And all of this stems from contaminated surface water that's been rendered completely unfit for human consumption because of this pollution.
But of course, it isn't just the water. Burning fossil fuels and heavy mining, they release massive amounts of toxic gas straight into our atmosphere. That air pollution is exactly what creates the harmful urban smog that just blankets our cities, driving up severe respiratory, nervous, and circulatory diseases. It even messes with our weather, causing acid rain. In fact, urban rainwater analysis shows that the pH value of the very first rain after summer is consistently lower, which means it's much more acidic than the rains that follow.
Which brings us right to Section 2, land degradation and urban waste.
So what happens when land is just used and used without any care for its fertility? Well, its productivity tanks. And when that degradation is just left unchecked, the land basically converts into a wasteland. But it's really interesting. Based on classifications from the National Remote Sensing Agency, not all wastelands are created equal. You've got natural wastelands, like gullied land, desertic sands, and barren rock. But compare that to human-made wastelands, things like degraded shifting cultivation areas, degraded forests, and mining wastelands. The data clearly shows that wastelands caused by man-made processes are actually way more prevalent than the natural ones.
And as that land degrades and our cities just continue to swell with people, we end up generating enormous, practically unmanageable amounts of solid waste. Now, major metropolitan cities like Mumbai or Kolkata do manage to collect and dispose of about 90% of their solid waste, but the reality for the rest of the country? It's a wake-up call. In most other cities and towns, roughly 30 to 50% of the waste generated is just left uncollected. It just piles up on the streets, in empty lots between houses, and right on those wastelands we were just talking about.
And let's be real, this uncollected solid waste, we're talking everything from broken glass and plastic to industrial ash, it's an absolute nightmare for public health. It creates a terrible smell, and worse, it becomes a massive breeding ground for flies and rodents. Those pests are direct carriers for devastating diseases like typhoid, diphtheria, malaria, and cholera. Plus, as all this untreated waste slowly ferments out in the open, it releases toxic biogas into the air, including methane. It's just this vicious, continuous cycle of environmental and human health degradation.
So where do people go when the land fails? That's Section 3, rural migration and city slums.
To really ground this, let's look back at some data from 2001. Back then, about 72% of India's total population was rural. But because of that extreme land degradation we mentioned, and just intensely low job opportunities out in the country, there is this massive flow of people moving into urban centers. And because development is so unbalanced between regions, a lot of poorer rural migrants just completely bypass the smaller cities. They pack up and head straight for the megacities, desperately searching for a way to make a living.
And when they get to those megacities, the contrast is just stark. It is polarized in a way that's hard to even wrap your head around. At the high end, you've got farmhouses and wealthy neighborhoods with wide roads, streetlights, green lawns, individual security. But then on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, you find the slums, the Jugija clusters, and these massive, sprawling colonies of shanty structures.
Our source has a very specific definition for these slums. They're described as residential areas of the least choice. Basically, migrants are forced into these environmentally incompatible, severely degraded spaces because rent and land costs elsewhere are just astronomical. These areas are incredibly dilapidated and overcrowded. We're talking poor ventilation, incredibly narrow streets that are massive fire hazards, and an almost complete lack of basic human amenities. No safe drinking water, no proper lighting, and no toilet facilities.
And because the folks living in these slums are usually forced to work in really high-risk, incredibly low-paid, unorganized sectors of the city's economy, they face chronic undernourishment and illness. And that extreme poverty, it breeds some serious social vulnerabilities. The environmental failure that pushed them out of their rural homes in the first place ultimately leads to heightened risks of drug abuse, alcoholism, crime, vandalism, escapism, and pretty much total social exclusion. So the cascade from degrading land to profound human suffering is complete.
Now, I know that is a lot of heavy information, but let's shift gears to Section 4, a community-driven environmental solution.
Let's zoom in on a very specific place for a case study, the Jhabua district in Madhya Pradesh. This is one of the 5 most backward districts in the entire country. It has a huge concentration of tribal population, primarily the Bhils, and they have struggled immensely with severe poverty, largely driven by an exceptionally high rate of both forest and land degradation. I mean, it is exactly the kind of failing environment we've been tracking this entire explainer.
But the narrative actually started to flip when the government teamed up with local NGOs to implement watershed management programs. I absolutely love this quote from the text because it nails the philosophy behind the solution. It says, watershed management programs acknowledge the linkage between land, water, and vegetation, and attempts to improve livelihoods of people through natural resource management and community participation. It's looking at the environment as a deeply interconnected system, and it relies directly on the local community to step in and heal it.
So how did this actually look on the ground? Well, in the Petload block of Jhabua, the Bhil community stepped up to revitalize their common property resources, and they did it in 3 clear steps. First, every single household committed to planting and maintaining 1 tree on the common land. Second, they actively planted fodder grass on the pasture land. And third, they adopted a practice called social fencing for at least 2 years. Basically, the whole community agreed to completely stop open grazing and instead rely on stall feeding for their cattle. They gave the land the breathing room it desperately needed to bounce back.
And honestly, the coolest part of this is how it changed the social dynamics. Before this management plan even started, a guy from an adjoining village had actually encroached on this common land. A big conflict was brewing. They even got local authorities involved. But instead of dragging out this bitter fight, the villagers used a genius tactic. They just offered the encroacher a membership in their user group. They literally brought him into the fold, letting him share in the benefits of greening the common lands. They turned a potential enemy into an active, vested ally for the environment. How amazing is that?
So that brings us to the big takeaway for today. We've traced this cascade from industrial pollution all the way to ruined land and watched how that forces people into really vulnerable urban slums. But the folks in Jhabua showed us the chain can actually be broken. So the question I want to leave you with is this. If a localized community facing extreme poverty and resource degradation can successfully reverse land ruin through shared responsibility and cooperation, how can we apply that model to our own environments? The solutions are definitely out there, but they start with how we choose to manage the space right around us. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this gives you a fresh, powerful lens to look at the world today.